Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We have another round of exciting segments based off of soccer and the Euros tournament coming up next for you guys. We are going to start off with, I know you guys know that fantasy soccer is getting more popular worldwide. There are so many different variants of how to play fantasy soccer. You have Fantasy Premier League, obviously from England, Fantasy Champions League, but how do you necessarily play fantasy? And so, in honor of the Euro starting up in a week now, I am going to tell you guys the tricks of the trade and how to play fantasy soccer. A little Euros edition to celebrate these tournaments that are coming up in the soccer world. So, buckle your seatbelts, guys. And heighten your ears. This is going to be a very exciting segment that I don't want you guys to miss out on 1 second of. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. So, for fantasy soccer, how it all works out. As any fantasy sport has, there is a budget. You have 100 million euros to spend on your squad. As the stages progress, as we get into the knockout rounds, you have $105 million to spend on your roster from the round of 16 onward. Now, in terms of your squad, you have a 15-player squad. You have 2 goalies, 5 defenders, 5 midfielders, and 3 forwards. And before every match day, you have to select 11 of those players, as obviously soccer is an 11-player game. However, you do have a limit on players from one team. So you can't have more than 3 or so players from one squad on your fantasy squad. Now, for each patch day, like I said, you have to pick your 11. All points will be scored from your 11. So the 4 players that you leave on your bench will not contribute to your squad's official point tally at the end of the day. Once you set your 11, you cannot change it. Getting into subs a little bit. You can sub any players into your squad except in the final, because obviously there are only 2 squads playing in the final. You can't necessarily rotate out that many players. So, you also can only sub in players who haven't already played on the match day. So, for example, if you have a player who you want to swap out and he's playing an earlier game, say a 12 noon game, and you have a guy in your squad who's playing a 3 o'clock game, you can only make that sub, right? You can't make a sub for a player who is playing at the same time in that match day. In terms of captains are a huge part of any fantasy soccer league because of the fact that, most importantly for them, every time they play, their point tallies are doubled. Once you captain them, their point tallies immediately double. You can't necessarily change your captain as much. It's kind of the same rule as with subs, where you can't play a captain if you already are playing him. Let's say he's playing already and you want to kind of change your captain. Oh, you see a little hidden gem on your bench who you might want a captain. You can't do that. So be careful in who you choose as your captain, because it's vital going forward that you really kind of center your team around who you want your captain to be. As with any fantasy league and in any soccer-specific fantasy league, you have to have transfers. Obviously, you have to have the opportunity to bring in players who you might like for your squad and let some go. However, there is a caveat. So, before the tournament begins, let's say you are crafting your fantasy squad. Unlimited amount of free transfers before the Euros even starts. So, let's say you're not comfortable with the team you picked. You have a little bit of budget money that you want to spend, and you want to use it on someone who you think can help your team. You can do that with all of your leisure before the Euros. However, getting into the Euros, there is a quota on who you can bring in. So, let's say you're in the group stages and you decide to bring in a player. Obviously, the number of players that you can't bring in goes up, if that makes sense, as the stages progress. So, let's say you're still in the group stages and you want a different player to bring into your squad, maybe a player who plays later in the match day. You're going to have to make sure that you hit that quota for the day, because you can't go over. If you go over, you are deducted 4 points from your squad. So make sure that on every match day, you pay attention to who's on the transfer market, so the fact that you can hit your quota in terms of free transfers for the day before the match day even begins, because once you're in the match day, you're kind of screwed if you have hit that quota already. So, without further ado, let's get into the most important parts of the fantasy soccer system. The points. Obviously, you have things like goals and assists, and they are very high. Goals for a midfielder are 5 points, so be wary of that. For a forward, they are 6 points. Actually, for a forward, they are 4 points, and then for a defender, obviously, since they are in the back line, 6 points. An assist for any player is 3 points. And last but not least, this is an interesting stat to know if you are looking for a midfielder who can kind of cut and shoot. A goal from outside the box is 1 point. And then for after-match things, Player of the Match award gives you 3 points. However, there is a negative connotation to point systems. You get rewarded in soccer for scoring goals. You get punished for things you do, and obviously that is reflected. So, if one of your players gets a yellow card, that is minus 1 point. If you have a red card, minus 3 points. So be very wary in terms of picking your back line, especially because you don't necessarily want a guy who's known to be a hothead. So be very careful, especially in terms of picking your defenders, because you don't necessarily want your point tally to be affected by something like a yellow card or red card. Now, goalies are a very special position because they obviously have their points tallied differently because they are not playing in the outfield. So, in terms of goalies, saving a penalty is probably the hugest point getter for goalies in fantasy soccer. Saving a penalty earns you 5 points. A clean sheet is also a very high tally. So, that gives you 4 points. But in terms of negative connotations, 2 goals conceded, you are deducted a point, and an own goal from actually any player deducts you 2 points. So, in terms of goalies, they're a very special player. It's one of those positions that you kind of have to pick and choose how you want to set up, because you get the opportunity to pick 2 goalies. So that rotation is going to be very interesting to see, especially if these match days all get muddled together and you really are kind of trying to figure out who to roster on your fantasy squad. So be very kind of wary of how to pick a good goaltender for your fantasy team. But that should just about do it for this segment. I really loved talking to you guys about this different kind of system. Obviously, I know you guys may already know about fantasy soccer, but for those who don't, it is really, really exciting. There are obviously a lot of different leagues that you can go into, not just for the upcoming Euros tournament. You can play Fantasy Premier League. When the Premier League comes back, you can play Fantasy Champions League. Obviously, kind of like the Euros, since it's a knockout tournament. You can play so many different varieties of fantasy soccer. But just to celebrate the hype of the Euros as it comes up in the next week, I just wanted to highlight that because it is very special to my heart and to the many soccer fans who might be viewing this right now. So, thank you guys. Coming up next, another exciting Euros segment where I'll be analyzing my very own Euros fantasy squad, seeing the different players who I really like and some of the players who I'm kind of taking a flyer on in my lineup. It should be a fantastic segment to close out today's show. Please stick around for that segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We will be right back. We'll end with a bang.